Hey everyone, in this video lecture, we are going to be talking about the evidence of evolution. So we need to understand, what is evolution? What do I mean when I'm talking about something evolving? And so evolution is looking at a change in inherited traits in a population over time. So this is really important to understand, that when we're talking about evolution, we're talking about it at a population level. We are not talking about a single individual evolving, a single species evolving. We're looking at populations and how their traits are changing over time. And these traits are inherited traits. So it's not like if I dye my hair a different color, that trait will be passed on, because it's not an inherited trait. So we're only looking at traits that have been inherited and how those traits change over time. And when we talk about evolution, really Charles Darwin is the person who developed this theory of evolution, and he did so after traveling the world and making really important observations of both plants and animals, and looking at how these different animals, like the finches of the Galapagos Islands, have similar traits, but yet slightly different traits related to different functions that these traits would serve, saying that one of these populations must have kind of came from the other, as he called it, descent with modification. And that putting all these observations together, he came up with this idea of natural selection, which we will be covering in more detail in a later video. But these observations are really the groundwork for what we understand about evolution today. So we're going to be talking about the evidence that supports Charles Darwin's theory of evolution, that there has been this change in traits over time. And there are really kind of four categories of evidence that we have to support this theory. We're going to look at each of these in more detail. So we're going to look at the fossil record. So we're going to compare some fossils. We're going to look at what we call comparative anatomy. So comparing bone structure from organism to organism. We're also going to look at molecular biology information. So we're going to go into the DNA, the protein sequences of organisms, and compare and look for similarities and differences. And then the last kind of category of evidence is a field called embryology. So where we're going to compare the shapes and traits of embryos at different stages of development to say, are these organisms similar or different? So if we start with the fossil record, so fossils are items from once living organisms. So it's kind of like bone material that has remained from organisms that were living really, really long time ago. And so we can look at a fossil record, which is just really lining up fossils and seeing change over time. So for example here, and we can really see that descent with modification, that phrase that Charles Darwin used. So if we're looking at these organisms which are lined up in the fossil record, so oldest to newest at the bottom, and we look at the structure of the skulls of these organisms, again, from kind of really distant past to more present, we can see that the shapes of their skulls are pretty similar, but we can see changes. We can see that as we go through time, the skull gets smaller, the horn on the top of the skull gets shorter and smaller, but there are similarities that make it look like you can see that change over time, that progression. And we can do this with lots of other organisms as well. So we can see kind of that ancient organism to modern day and how that change over time occurred. We can also look at comparative anatomy, and there are really just three kind of categories that we can look at, or three different types of structures. So again, we're just going to be comparing body parts, bones, between related as well as unrelated organisms to say who must be related to who. How can we see that change in traits over time? So again, the fossil record, we could really line up those fossils and see the change over time. But with comparative anatomy, we want to compare both related organisms to unrelated to see how things may or may not have changed. So there are three types of anatomy we're going to look at. We're going to look at analogous structures, homologous structures, and vestigial structures. So these can be pretty confusing, especially the analogous and homologous. So we'll start with analogous structures. So what we're doing here is we're going to compare unrelated organisms. And what we notice about these unrelated organisms is that they have structures with the same function. So for example, a bat and a butterfly, two very different organisms. Taxonomically, they're very different. So here on the left, we have a bat wing, and on the right, we have a monarch butterfly wing. The structure itself of the wing is different, but both use the wing for flight. So this tells us that evolutionarily, it was important to have wings. Even though these organisms probably didn't evolve from one another, it was important evolutionarily to evolve to have wings because these organisms are not related, so they didn't really evolve one from the other. But it was important enough to have wings that they both evolved to have them. Okay, so analogous structures, we're making an analogy between these two unrelated organisms that have structures with the same function but different actual structure to them. Like a bat wing and a butterfly wing are structurally different, but the wings serve the same purpose, to give them flight. So homologous structures are where we're going to compare related organisms to one another and see that they have similar structures but maybe different functions. So this is just showing that that kind of descent with modification. We have evolved from one another, so we have the exact same bones, but we now use them for different purposes. So on the left, we have the human arm, the bones inside the human arm. And on the right, we have a whale flipper. And what we notice, the colors here indicate the different types of bones in these arms. They both have a pink bone. They both have the blue bone and green bone and all the little purple finger bones. But yet, a human and a whale use these bones, use these structures for very different purposes. A human is using their arm for movement. They're using it to pick things up. Whereas the whale is using those same exact bones, but for that motion to swim through the water. So this tells us that humans and whales must be related to one another. Because we have the exact same bones, we must have evolved from some common ancestor that also had these bones. But through time, we are now using the structure for different functions. And then lastly, we have vestigial structures. So these are structures that no longer have any function anymore. So for example, in snakes, in their bone structure, they have little legs. They do not have legs, but the fact that they have these little leg bones indicates that this organism, this snake, must have came from a common ancestor in the past that had legs. It came from an organism that did have legs for walking, but it no longer uses them. So over time, it has descended, that descent with modification, to no longer use those legs anymore. So the structure is still there, but they don't use it. So again, it indicates that this organism must have evolved from something that did have legs. And in humans, there are many different vestigial structures. We have an appendix, which is kind of in your stomach area. We don't use it. We have our wisdom teeth. We have tailbones ourselves. Our tailbones, it's a bone that would have been a tail, indicating that we must have evolved from an organism that did have a tail, but we didn't need that structure anymore, so we no longer use it, have it, but we have the little bone to indicate that it was once there. So that shows that descent with modification. We've descended from something with these structures, but we no longer use them. So that comparative anatomy can be very powerful in showing, who's related to who, how we've been descent with modification over time. The next piece of evidence of evolution is using molecular biology. And this might be our most powerful piece of evidence yet. And a lot of research has come to light more recently about this evolution because we've had a lot more powerful DNA technologies come out, where we can look at the DNA sequences or protein sequences of organisms and look for identical sequences. The more identical the DNA or protein sequences are, the more closely related those organisms must be. So for example, this chart is comparing humans to different organisms and looking at the number of differences in the protein sequences. So this particular protein that we're comparing, so this is not all proteins in your body, but this one particular protein that we're comparing between humans and chimpanzees, identical. There's no differences. If we compare that same protein in humans to rhesus monkeys, there's only one amino acid that's different. Compare that to rabbits, there's 9. Compare that down to a bullfrog, there's 20. If we compare it to wheat germ, we're at 37, and so on. So you can see how organisms that we think we're more closely related to have very similar protein sequences. Organisms that we know we're probably very distantly related to, many more differences. And we can actually take all this and put this information into big phylogenetic trees and kind of put together that tree of life using these DNA and protein sequences to really show who must have evolved from who. And the last category of evidence that we can look at is embryology. So this is where we are going to compare the embryos of different organisms that are not really related to one another, and we're going to look at them at different stages of development. And we can look for some similarities that would suggest there must be a common ancestor. So if we look at the embryos of a chick, a mouse, and a lizard, we notice that in those early stages of embryonic development, the chick, the mouse, and the lizard have these 3 little lines which represent gill slits, indicating these all are individuals that have evolved from an organism that had gills. But that again, descent with modification, the chick, the mouse, the lizard no longer have the gills as their embryos further develop because they don't need them, they didn't use them. Same thing here with the chick with the tail. So you can kind of see in the early development, it has somewhat of a tail, not as pronounced as the mouse and lizard who do have currently have tails. But you can see it then shrink even further as that embryo continues to develop. So you can see those similarities that again are indicating that way in the distant past, there must have been some sort of common ancestor to give us those similarities in our embryos.